The method I make most use of would be qualitative interviewing. So, often in the context of evaluation, but not only.
So what kind of research questions would you use that for?
Most of my work is concerned with health inequalities. So often it's about using the method as part of an evaluation of an intervention that has a stated aim around tackling health inequalities. For example, looking at the assumption that if health visitors had more direct access to information about families' living circumstances, the material circumstances, then they would develop a more robust understanding of the social determinants of health. And the qualitative study suggested that that didn't happen particularly. By the end of the study, there were health visitors who still had a rather clinical and medical model. So the quasi-experimental study showed very little impact of the intervention.
Were the qualitative methods, did you actually measure outcomes? Did the qualitative data really tell you whether it had worked or not in terms of outcomes?
The survey told us that it hadn't worked in terms of outcomes.
So that was quantitative data from the survey.
Yeah. So the qualitative component was able to identify some of the issues and why the intervention may not have been successful.
Yes, I mean my thing, I come from more of a quantitative background where it's not necessarily the most important question you're asking when you're doing an evaluation, but one of the most important questions is actually does this intervention work? You know, the reason you've invested in an intervention is to try and bring about a difference in whatever the outcome might be, whether it's trying to help people give up smoking or whether it's trying to help people lose weight. So there is always, I think, an important part of what you're doing in an evaluation is not just understanding what's going on, which clearly you're picking up through the interviews, but really actually has this made a difference?
I'm uncomfortable with many aspects of experimental designs. One of the problems is that often when there are studies which bring together randomised controlled trials with qualitative components, you say that the primary question isn't always does it work? But of course, from a funding point of view, it tends to be the question that's given salience and it's the method that's given salience. So sometimes I think that can be awkward for qualitative researchers. Even if it's not the original intention, you can end up playing second fiddle to a design that doesn't feel to be capturing all of the salient questions.
Yeah. I mean, the kind of studies design I use quite a lot is a randomised controlled trial, which is like an experimental type design. And the beauty of that is it's very simple, but if you do a randomised trial well, then actually it really helps you make some quite strong inferences about whether or not there is an effect of the interventions. And the beauty of the randomisation is that once you've recruited people into the study, whether or not they receive the intervention or not is purely determined by the toss of a coin or the roll of a dice. And so what's really good about the randomisation is that it does ensure that the two groups are the same, apart from differences that might occur due to chance. All the women in the study might be randomised to one group and all the men to another group, so you can get chance differences like that, but that's fairly unlikely. And I think it is a powerful way of answering that kind of question. It has very high internal validity because you've taken out those potential differences between the two groups that might be due to selection biases or other biases. You have to be very careful that the process of data collection isn't a big dose of intervention itself.
So if you were including a qualitative component, qualitative interviewing, for example, would you undertake work looking at context and implementation in the site receiving the intervention as well as the site not receiving the intervention?
Yes, I would. I think it's really important to do that, but you have to make sure that you're not introducing any other differences between the groups through your research methods. A lot of people are sometimes tempted just to do some quite intensive interviewing with people in the intervention group and not do that in the control group, and you're then bringing in quite a big difference between what the two groups are being exposed to. So the intervention group is getting the intervention plus lots of interviews, and the control group is not getting the intervention or the interview. So if you collect the interview data in both groups, then that's not a difference, not a bias that you're introducing.
But that's interesting then, because you answered that question viewing qualitative methods themselves as a possible confounder.
It can be, yeah.
So what was lying behind my question was whether you have been involved in studies which have used qualitative methods in comparison areas in order to unpick mechanisms in the comparison areas. It's not a means of levelling out the research input in the two areas, it's for more fundamental reasons.
What a lot of people think about a randomised control trial is you can only really use it if you've got a very simple question, and that's often where you're using an RCT design to really identify causal relationships. So for example, in many psychology departments, the students partake in experimental psychology type experiments where a very uniform group of people would take part in the study, and then half of them would be given a very specific dose of something like caffeine and others would be given another dose of caffeine.
I've been that experimental psychology student.
Right, so it's just like, so very much a guinea pig situation, and that is one powerful use of experimental methods, of strict experimental designs, randomised control trial. But the kind of studies I do are where you've got a lot more noise, a lot more kind of variation. And so an example of a study I did was to evaluate the introduction of fruit tuck shops in primary schools to try and help increase fruit consumption of young children by having tuck shops that just sold fruit. We didn't in that study collect much qualitative data. What is so often the case in a randomised trial is it only answers one question. It just says, does this work, does this not? So do kids in those schools eat more fruit than kids in those schools? The randomised trial identifies whether the outcomes are different in the two groups, but it doesn't know why. So if you find a big difference, it doesn't know why. If you don't find a difference, it doesn't know why the intervention hasn't worked as you might have thought. So and that's really because the level of inference from a typical randomised trial, particularly these experimental psychology type trials, very positivist. It's just the level of the numbers really. I'm myself more of a critical realist, so I like to understand what's going on behind the numbers. I think you can do trials that can actually not only give you that number to indicate whether the intervention works or not, but can also begin to explain why.
So this was a study that was trying to understand how in two deindustrialised areas of Scotland health had become very poor and circumstances had become very poor. And this is a minor talking here. I was going and standing on top of a coal bin to stop neighbours of mine heating their house. So there I had come full circle. I'm even against my own neighbours now. And just before the minimum wage came in, it came in to roughly, was it £4 or something? It was quite high. It wasn't too bad when it came in. And the week before it came in, my highest wage, and I was a supervisor, remember, my highest wage was only £2 an hour. And the bad thing about it, but I didn't know this at the time, I was on top of a coal bin. It's a coal place sat on top of a coal bin, I can assure you. One of the bosses from the coal company came up in his Land Rover and he stopped beside me and he said, "Have you got many coal thieves on?" I said, "No, it's kind of quiet." The rain was steadily hammering down at the side of my face and he says, "Do you know something? It's bloody terrible. The security dogs are making more money than what you are." I read that particular quote out because for me it exemplifies what you get from qualitative methods, an aspect of structural context that I think often mixed methods approaches tend to downplay. So that even where you have qualitative interviews as part of a mixed method experimental design, I think sometimes context is quite narrowly conceived. One of the things that occurred to me then was whether, when we're thinking about mixed methods, should we be thinking more broadly about context? Or indeed, can we be thinking about mixed methods not necessarily in terms of individual studies, but it would be really nice to see qualitative literature reflected more in the kinds of papers that are written about experimental trials.
Well, it's very powerful data, and I think there's no doubt that what you learn from it, you couldn't pick up from a primarily quantitative study at all. And as you say, it's really trying to understand context and what's going on, rather than, obviously what a trial is about is trying to see what's making a difference or what could make a difference.
It's a different sort of power.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying I'm always successful, I try to make sure that all of the perspectives you bring together in a team, including the qualitative researcher, the person who's really, or it should be the whole team who's really thinking through the theory of the intervention and continually thinking about how is the data that we're collecting, whether it be qualitative or quantitative, how is that developing my understanding from a theoretical perspective. What's going on here is really important, and all of those different disciplines and research methods and perspectives need to be equally respected in a good interdisciplinary research team. I see a huge number of benefits of qualitative methods, particularly when they're done in conjunction with the more quantitative. You've talked about some situations where you think it's really only qualitative methods that can help, so really understanding context and particularly the meaning of that context and the kind of like the power and resources available to people and how that impacts their lives. I can see you can really identify that these needs are occurring, or this developmental kind of process is occurring through qualitative methods. But how does the data you collect and the way you can interpret the data, how does then that directly inform like a decision maker? What kind of research do we need to do to help them really understand what they need to do to make a difference? And I guess sometimes I wonder, what does qualitative research on its own really offer, that more consequential research?
Well, I'm just finishing a CSO final report which uses qualitative methods and some routine data from an intervention which was trying to open a channel of communication between the police and general practice in relation to domestic abuse. So what we were doing was we were auditing a pathway by which women would be identified as at high risk of future victimisation. Very early on, we realised that the pathway was not working. So using the constructs within normalisation process theory, we were able to make some very specific recommendations to Police Scotland about how such an intervention would more likely become embedded within routine police practice.
So I can see
routine data, the quantitative data allowed us to say this is not working, and then qualitative theory that had been developed through qualitative approaches helped us to make, as I say, specific recommendations.
But then you don't really know whether those recommendations have made a difference.
Well, those haven't been tested,
right? Yeah.
But they easily could be.
So often when you have qualitative and quantitative researchers come together, it's like as if they're gearing up to have a war, because it's always set up in such an oppositional way that you have to choose between the methods, particularly in evaluative research. You know, you can get so much richness by bringing the two together, both in sequence, both by having rich qualitative understandings, informing intervention design that can then be tested, but equally they can be used at the same time. And I think we've both come up with examples where the most exciting findings we've gotten from our studies is because we've had the qualitative and the quantitative methods to inform each other.
And of course, in terms of evaluation research, it would be almost impossible to find a study that didn't involve mixed methods.
I think that's true in our field. I think, though, if you was to still look in other fields, it's still hugely predominantly try to control complexity and heterogeneity out of their study designs, rather than using the opportunity to embrace that heterogeneity and use mixed methods to really understand what's going on and how context relates to interventions to produce outcomes, and those outcomes might vary across population groups and contexts. And
sure.
I think that kind of research is really interesting, and that's really adding value to our interdisciplinary understandings of phenomena, which is what is so important in science nowadays, rather than just sort of focusing down on one simple thing in a simple way.
Which is why I've put as much clear water between myself and an undergraduate psychology degree as I possibly can.